Today, we are joined by Francisco Rodriguez, Rice Family Professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Korbel School of International Studies, and Director and founder of Oil for Venezuela, an NGO focused on finding solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. Francisco is the author of the report The Human Consequences of Economic Sanctions, published by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, in which he provides a comprehensive assessment of the existing literature surrounding the effects of economic sanctions on living standards in target countries. Welcome, Francisco. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Anita. It's nice to be here.
So, as an economist, you are well known for your work on economic growth, trade policies, and economic development. So, could you tell us how you came to work on the topic of sanctions?
Yes. Well, it started with my interest in the Venezuelan economy. I'm a Venezuelan, and I've also written several papers and a book on Venezuela's economic growth. And when I started looking at the period of the past decade, we see an economic implosion in Venezuela. We see a huge decline, 72% decline in per capita income, which is the largest decline ever observed in Latin America, and also the largest observed in the world outside of war. So when I view this as an academic and looking at it from the standpoint of economic growth, it poses a puzzle in the same way in which some scholars study growth miracles. I also think it makes a lot of sense to study growth disasters. When we see these economies completely implode, we want to understand what's going on there. So I started researching the causes for the country's decline, and immediately came up against the big role of the oil sector decline. And when we started looking at what had happened in the oil sector and how did this country lose 93% of its oil export revenue over the course of 8 years, there the impact of sanctions started to be very clear. So that's one of the reasons that got me involved. But also, more broadly, as you pointed out, my research has been on growth and international trade. And one of the things that struck me the more that I learned about sanctions is how absent they are from the traditional discussion of international trade and growth among economists. In fact, if you look at international trade textbooks, they make in many cases, some of the standard textbooks used to teach trade make no mention of sanctions. Despite that, we know that, and we've corroborated, and I've corroborated it in my recent work, that sanctions affect up to a third of the world economy. So there's this big missing factor, which has to do with the mixture of politics and international politics and trade policy and economic policy, which I think is really important to understand the world that we live in.
Great answer. So, could you elaborate on one of the cases laid out in the report so that our audience can understand the kind of evidence presented and the arguments that are being made? For example, there's a debate about the extent to which the U.S.-led sanctions against Venezuela are the prime cause of the country's economic crisis. So, is it possible? And you just said it yourself. So, is it possible to disentangle the economic consequences of sanctions also from the economic mismanagement of the targeted governments?
It is possible at times, but it is very difficult, particularly at the level of specific case studies. And let me play a bit with an analogy. If you ask a climate scientist, does humanly induced climate change lead to an increase in the prevalence of natural disasters? The overwhelming majority of climate scientists will tell you yes, it's decisively proven. But if you ask them, well, there was this hurricane that hit the Caribbean last month, can you claim, can you establish that that hurricane was caused by climate change? Many of them will tell you, well, no, we know that climate change leads to an increased prevalence, but we can't always pinpoint that specific events are associated with climate change. The same thing happens at the level of cross-national research on the impact of sanctions. We're much better at using statistical patterns with the cross-country data to establish that sanctions are associated with declines in per capita income and with deteriorations in living conditions and in health conditions than we are at being able to decisively prove that they're the driving factor in any particular case. Now, nevertheless, it's extremely important to the debate in those cases because the almost everybody who's interested in Venezuela, including many political actors from many sides of the spectrum, really want to understand to what extent sanctions are an important driving factor, or as you said, the driving factor. I'll tell you what I think we've been able to answer about this. First of all, sanctions are not the only driving factor. I mean, that's clear. There are other economic policy decisions, as well as mismanagement and corruption, which severely affected Venezuelan economic performance. Venezuela enjoyed during the period between 2000 and 2012 one of the largest oil booms ever experienced by any Latin American country. And in fact, by far the largest experience in that period in Latin America. It had an 800% increase in its terms of trade, that is, its purchasing power derived from its exports. Nevertheless, the Chavez administration essentially squandered that oil boom, and therefore the country was left not only with very little savings, but with very high levels of external debt, so that when oil prices started declining in 2014, it was unable to adjust to that shock. So there's definitely a very important component here from poor economic policies. Nevertheless, when we look at the data, we also see that there's a very strong contribution of sanctions to the country's economic decline. Because oil prices, as I was telling you, declined between 2014 and 2016. They fell from $100 a barrel to less than $30 a barrel, but then they recovered. And they increased by 80% over the course of the next 2 years. But Venezuela's economy continued going down. And this is very atypical. In fact, in past periods of crisis, whenever oil prices recovered, Venezuela's economy started to recover also. So, what was it that happened? Well, what happened is that oil production started declining. And when we look at this time series on oil production, we find that the declines in production are closely associated, and particularly the changes in trend in production are closely associated with the timing of sanctions. So you see in the series an acceleration of the rate of decline in August 2017 with the first financial sanctions. You see another acceleration in January of 2019 with the first oil sanctions, and you see another one in February of 2020 when sanctions were imposed for the first time on the country's foreign oil partners. So all of this configures in itself pretty strong evidence. I've also done some work looking at firm level data and looking at the firms that were most affected by sanctions, particularly in the oil sector. And we also find evidence that firms that had access to finance before the 2017 financial sanctions, which closed off that access, saw much faster drops in the level of their oil output than those firms that had never had access to finance. So all of this configures very strong evidence that sanctions have been an important contributing factor to the decline. How much of the decline do they explain? Well, there's always a confidence interval, depending on different estimation methods. But I would say, in order to take a conservative figure, about at least half of the decline in oil production is attributable to sanctions, possibly more. And that really is a major effect, because if Venezuela were producing the same amount of oil that it was producing back in 2015 at current oil prices, then this would be a country with a massively higher level of export revenues, and therefore with much better living conditions. So in that sense, I think that we can safely say that sanctions have been a major contributor to the decline. And if you want to get precise about a number, we can conservatively say that they explain about at least half of the decline in oil production, which is the main driving factor of Venezuela's economic decline. But there are certainly other factors that are also very relevant.
Impressive. It's a lot. And it's impressive that, as you said, it doesn't show up in, textbooks. So there are a range of views about economic sanctions. Those who defend their use argue that they are a necessary tool to introduce behavioral change in the targeted entities or countries. And then others see them as a form of economic warfare exercised mainly by the West and particularly by the United States against non Western countries. So, in the report, you allude to the question of intentionality. For instance, when you discuss US officials talking about Russia and Iran, I'm referring specifically to the following excerpt, and I'm gonna read it if you don't mind. It says, "It appears clear that some of the economic and humanitarian impact of sanctions on targeted populations is intended. For example, a statement issued by the UK government after freezing Russian central bank assets in February 2022 stated unambiguously that sanctions will devastate Russia's economy. In February 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated in response to a question about the effects of sanctions on Iran, things are much worse for the Iranian people, and we are convinced that that will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime." Pompeo made similar statements about US sanctions in Venezuela the following month. So, would you say economic sanctions are used as an alternative to war or as a mechanism to incite homegrown revolts aimed at overthrowing certain regimes without boots on the ground? And what is your assessment of the question of intentionality as a whole?
So that's definitely how they're used in some cases. I think it's very important to start out from a distinction between personal targeted sanctions and broad economic, or which are also known as sectoral sanctions. There are a number of cases in which the U.S. government has put sanctions on individuals in particular countries. For example, for particular politicians in Paraguay or in Panama, that where the sanctions have only been leveled at those individuals and have not been leveled at the economy. And I think that those sanctions are, first of all, I do think that they're a necessary tool of foreign policy, and I do think that they have an important place. And I think that the evidence on the effect of those sanctions is that they don't really have a major effect on the economy of these countries. As long as they're targeted and as long as they're reasonably limited at some actors that are involved in wrongdoing. Then at the other extreme, you have economic sanctions. The sanctions imposed on Venezuela are sanctions on its oil sector. Sanctions imposed against Iran are also sanctions on its oil sector. In both countries, you have a central bank that's sanctioned, and the central bank plays an extremely important role in keeping any economy afloat. So if the central bank can't carry out international transactions, that by itself is going to provoke a currency crisis in that country. In those cases, it's very clear that they have an effect on the economy, and that's very much documented in the report that I authored, where we surveyed 32 quantitative studies and found that of these, 30 found unambiguously negative effects of sanctions on living conditions in target countries, sometimes very large and significant effects. So, for example, sanctions are associated with a decline of 26% in GDP per capita of targeted countries. That's the equivalent of the decline in US GDP during the Great Depression. Sanctions are associated with an increase, with a decline, of 1.4 years in female life expectancy. That is equivalent to the effect on life expectancy of the global COVID pandemic. So these are very large effects, and it is clear that policymakers are aware of those effects. And the quotes that you just read clearly indicate that in these cases, they know what they're doing. I mean, they know that these sanctions are going to very strongly hurt the economy. Now, do they do it because they want to incite a homegrown revolt? What is the theory of change that is behind these sanctions? I think sometimes it's that. Sometimes they are seen as a way to try to break the governing coalition. So in the Venezuelan case, it was also very clear that overtures that the U.S. tried to make overtures to the Venezuelan military so that the military would overthrow Maduro. Those overtures ended up being ineffective, which kind of leads us to another big problem of sanctions, which is if they fail, as the empirical evidence tells you that most of the time they do, they don't reach their intended ends, then what do you do? Because Venezuela then ended up trapped in the worst of both worlds, ruled by an authoritarian leader and with sanctions imposed on its economy. And that to a certain extent is one big problem, which is that even though they're a tool which makes sense from a theoretical standpoint to induce behavioral change in the targeted entity, at the same time, they have these massive collateral effects on the population. And this really requires ourselves to ask the question, well, given that these sanctions can be as deadly as a war, is it legitimate to continue using them for the purposes of inducing regime change? And when you add to that the fact that a lot of the times they're ineffective, then and they don't reach their intended aims, then the argument for continuing to use them is highly questionable.
So, some critics of sanctions distinguish between the Western and US led sanctions, often referred to as unilateral coercive measures, and those imposed by the UN Security Council. Others discuss the differences between blanket sanctions and so called smart sanctions, which target the leadership of regimes. So, what is your opinion about these distinctions, not only in terms of impact and effectiveness, but also in terms of legitimacy?
Yeah, I'll start with the Western or U.S.-led sanctions vis-a-vis UN Security Council. I'm not a lawyer, and that is really a discussion among legal scholars. So there are some legal scholars that claim that the UN Charter, because it empowers the UN Security Council to impose sanctions, it also precludes countries from imposing individual sanctions on their own. There are others who argue, on the contrary, that any country has the right to restrict its trade with the rest of the world. Countries do it all the time when they impose tariffs or trade restrictions. So there's no restriction in using that to pursue foreign policy ends. That's a debate on which I don't necessarily weigh in because it's really a legal debate. But I would say this. There's a reason why the UN Security Council restriction was imposed, and it comes from the fact that there had been a previous attempt to create a sanctions regime with the League of Nations after World War One, and the League of Nations did not have a veto mechanism like what we have today, which allows a permanent member of the Security Council to veto sanctions. And therefore, the League of Nations actually imposed sanctions on Italy after its invasion to Ethiopia, and those sanctions were not only remarkably ineffective in that they didn't get Italy to change anything, and Italy continued occupying Ethiopia up until the end of the war, but it also, those sanctions, through the Italian government headed by Benito Mussolini at the time, into becoming a very staunch German ally. So part of the roots, I wouldn't say of World War II occurring in itself, but at least of the Germans being able to have both Italy and Japan, because there was a similar incident with Japan as allies, can be traced back to the unfortunate way in which sanctions were managed during the time of the League of Nations. So that's why when this regime started being rebuilt with the UN and the creation of the UN Security Council, there was a restriction that was put in there, which was a restriction that's intended to assure that there is a broad, overarching consensus through a UN Security Council resolution approved by the majority of the UN Security Council, and not vetoed by any permanent member, that sanctions need to be imposed. And we've seen that consensus, and we continue to see it, for example, today in the case of North Korea. Sanctions, UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea are in place, and they're supported by both Russia and China, despite their conflict with the United States. So when you stray into the ground of saying, okay, let's not accept these restrictions, and let's have the US or the EU just go its own way and impose sanctions, you can end up having this overuse of sanctions that we're seeing right now, where you have 27% of countries and 29% of the world economy affected by sanctions, most of them unilateral sanctions from the US. And it can really lead to the breakdown of the world trading system. And they're also remarkably ineffective because these numbers have increased significantly in the past few decades. If you look back at the 1990s, it was around 10% of countries that were sanctioned. If you look back at the 1960s, it was about 5% of countries. So sanctions have a logic of isolating, of trying to isolate the targeted countries. It's one thing to try to isolate 5 or 10% of the world. It's another thing to try to isolate 1/3 of the world economy. That is not going to work. On the question of blanket sanctions and so called smart sanctions, which to a certain extent I already introduced it when I was talking about targeted sanctions versus economy-wide sanctions. One of the problems that I see, I think that the distinction is useful, and I believe I wish that that distinction was obeyed more. But the reality is that what we have seen happen, particularly with U.S. sanctions policy over the course of the past decade, is that it's using instruments of targeted sanctions, of these so-called smart sanctions, which are supposed to be targeted at particular entities. But then the U.S. says, well, no, we're going to designate the state-owned oil company, or we're going to designate the central bank, or we're going to impose designations on the finance minister and the vice president and all of the cabinet. And this is something very interesting that the U.S. does when it enforces these policies, is that it also precludes any type of interaction with these actors as government officials, which doesn't really make that much logical sense. Because if you decided that the vice president of Venezuela is corrupt and you want to sanction him for his corruption, well, then yes, U.S. banks should not be able to open up a bank account for that person. But that doesn't mean that they should block any transactions that he's carrying out on behalf of the Venezuelan state, because the Venezuelan state needs to function. Now, OFAC, the U.S. Treasury Department office in charge of enforcement of these sanctions, has been very clear at prohibiting any U.S. persons without an explicit authorization from OFAC into entering into any type of negotiations with government officials, even if just because they have been personally targeted. So it's a blurring of the distinction, which I think also introduces the concern that the concept of smart sanctions has really just become a mechanism through which the U.S. And other actors can pretend that their sanctions are targeted while using them to replicate the effect of wholesale trade and financial embargoes on countries, which can be and are very damaging to the economies of the target countries.
Thank you so much. Is there anything you would like to add that we haven't covered yet before we end the interview?
Yes, I think that it's necessary that we as a society, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries imposing sanctions, have an open, recent public debate about these instruments. Now, as I said, I understand that some sanctions have a role, and I think it's important, for example, if you identify terrorist groups, to be able to block their access to the global financial system. But I also think that there's very clear evidence as have laid out that sanctions in the way in which they're being used today are having severe effects on humanitarian conditions and are aggravating and in some cases creating some of the world's worst humanitarian crises. This is something that needs to be discussed more. There needs to be more control, for example, by legislatures, by Congress, as to how and when the US government is using sanctions. There should be, for example, to give an example of a concrete idea, the US government does not produce any type of impact assessment of its sanctions. That's the first thing that it should do. If it's going to impose sanctions on a particular country, on a particular actors, it should first of all, clearly research what the possible effect of those sanctions are before they're implemented. And then once they're implemented, collect data on their effects so that we can identify if those sanctions are worsening the humanitarian situation. What is the way to mitigate those effects? What's the way to correct them? What's the way to amend sanctions? But we're not going to have the, and this is something that Congress could do. Congress could mandate the executive branch to carry out impact assessments of the effects of their sanctions on humanitarian conditions in target countries. But in order to get Congress to do this, first we have to have a much broader public debate and public awareness about what the effect of these instruments are on some of the world's most vulnerable populations.
Francisco Rodriguez, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with me today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I hope we can keep collaborating.
Thank you very much, Anita, for this invitation. It's been a pleasure being here.